The Bliss Business Podcast, the show about empathy, connection, and consciousness in business. Today's episode is brought to you by Zero Company, your paid search, social media, and programmatic ad experts.
Hello and welcome back to the show. We're continuing our discussion on building partnerships with suppliers rather than treating them as just vendors. This is a huge part of helping grow and spread higher consciousness in business. I'm Steven Zakash here once again with Julio Siragusa and Ash Marr. So last show we got into some of the difficulties companies find themselves in when their purpose isn't aligned with their vendors. It's more aligned just solely on profits. And so when some are constantly pursuing profits and they start watering down quality, you see some problems there. And then we also discussed wood pulp in shredded cheese. Thanks, Ash. Good stuff. Guys, let's talk about the good and the bad and the ugly here. Let's start with some classic cases here of vendor situations gone sideways on companies because they're just pursuing that, lowest bidder kind of approach. Let's talk about Nike, which hit the news in the 90s, late 90s in a bad way. Ash, do you want to recap this for everyone?
Yeah. So this was a time that was interesting. It was when manufacturing costs started going up for the Nike shoes. Demand was super high for Nike at the time. And the way the vendors that Nike worked with try to solve this problem was take their manufacturing into a little bit of the more underdeveloped sides of the country. And it was, connecting the dots at the time. I don't think Nike connected the dots at the time, but when this manufacturing change occurred, it was probably one of their more profitable years. I think either this was 95, this was mid-90s when this was all happening, going down. So then people started to discover, I think there was a picture of a Pakistani child in terrible conditions sewing a Nike football. And there was other images of horrible conditions where children were working in these environments. It showed that the wages were unlivable wages, and people started becoming more and more aware of this. So next thing you know, there was protests and arguments occurring, and people started protesting the brand itself. And it got so loud that by 1998, Phil Knight made a statement. So I pulled some information on this, actually. It was funny enough, you could find all of this on a wiki article, but the quote from Phil Knight himself was, and this was in 1998. So you imagine when they were at the top of their game, and then this all started happening, this was the statement made. "I truly believe the American consumer doesn't want to buy products made under abusive conditions." Really, Phil? You truly believe? What did it take for you to believe that? Was it the protest outside the door? What was it? But anyways, so that was one of, I think, the big eye openers to a lot of companies. Ended up having that scope on them, right? Are they all treating their employees this way? What other manufacturing companies are taking advantage of people overseas and putting them through these conditions? I think it really brought tons of awareness during that time.
Yeah, kind of a huge issue for Nike and just the fashion industry in general. Just, I think Nike, what they were outsourcing to a couple countries, right? And then they were just looking for the lowest bidder as those prices got a little higher. And so they were just shopping for the cheapest price and didn't care what that meant. What was the cost of that? So, yeah. And obviously that just backfired spectacularly. Tulio, what comes to mind for you? Give us a story on the supply chain going sideways.
Yeah, this is actually a great example for those who might be sort of on the fence about what's this empathetic thing about? Does it cost more? This is the financials driven conversation, right? So the reason why you want to apply empathy in your relationships with your partner. So here's an example of Mattel. They had a lead paint recall. So just a little background, in 2007, they recalled millions of toys due to lead paint, which is dangerous for anybody, but especially for children. And the recall really highlighted Mattel's failure to ensure strict safety standards and really empathy towards the end consumer. It also exposed poor oversight of their suppliers. So the outcome was that Mattel had to pay millions of dollars and eroded consumer trust in order to fix this. But we're not talking about millions of dollars. I'm not talking about just a few $1 million. We're talking about possibly to the tune of $250 million. So the direct recall costs break down like this: 21 million toys were recalled. So there was the cost associated with the logistics of having put all those toys out, then recalling them back, disposing of the toys, and refunding consumers. Then testing and retesting the product, make sure that they were meeting the safety standards. So there's all these direct costs associated to that. Then there were indirect costs, like their legal fees and settlement. They got fined by the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commissioner to the tune of $2.3 million. The trust from consumers was impacted. That could have had an impact in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And then, of course, there was the cost of the supplier oversight, making sure that there were stricter oversight for suppliers, audits, safety checks, quality control. So when you break it all down, compared to what it would have cost to have done this right to begin with,
just doing those audits, safety checks, and
we're talking. The recall cost them about $110 million in direct costs alone. That does not include all the other things they had to do, all their supply chain fix and realignment had to do, the disposing of which was probably another $100 million. So huge expense. Where the alternative to have actually spent just a little more time vetting the vendors, I mean, maybe the cost of that might have been an additional headcount, someone who actually would do and take the time to do the due diligence and make sure it was all correct and all that. So let's call it a really good procurement officer. Maybe it would have cost $200,000 a year, right? That's a lot less expensive than $200 million possibly in expense of doing this recall. And so ultimately, it's like, when you don't show, this is an example of when you don't think about your supply chain as an extension to how you provide empathy for your end customers. Empathy meaning that you care for them enough to let them know that you've taken the time and the energy to put something out that actually benefits them. Then this is the potential risk that you take, right? You cut corners, some people don't get caught with this. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. And so in this situation, it's a perfect example of the cost of having done it correctly would have probably been less than a fraction of the amount of money it cost them to deal with it. Not to mention the consumer, the erosion in consumer confidence in them. So it's just not worth it. The empathy always wins. Do the right thing.
Yeah, it's usually going to pay for itself in the long run. And I think that's the problem, is this long-term, short-term view of things. I think we're always chasing the quarterly returns. We're always chasing, hey, getting those prices down. And then when you've got this sort of problem arise, when you're always pursuing that, you're going to be more likely probably to try and sweep it under the rug and not address it and let someone else deal with it, because you've got options coming up, that are driving your decision-making.
And part of that problem isn't all sitting with the companies. Part of it is the way the financial system works. You can write off these things in a different way on your general ledger, which doesn't impact necessarily the numbers that Wall Street's judging you on. So in some ways, it's like the policies also excuse this kind of activity. It's just a bad thing all around. So it comes down to self-regulating. It's like, just do the right thing and avoid these risks of these costs. And the comparison is it's huge. What would it cost them? Maybe $500,000 to do it right versus almost $250 million.
So I want to talk about another case. This one, if you read the book Conscious Capitalism, I believe it's in there. It's talking about GM a few decades ago. So this is chasing those lower costs, right? So they adopted this really highly aggressive cost-cutting approach to their suppliers. They had pitting suppliers against suppliers to reduce costs, the lowest possible prices they could get. They're just routinely hammering on them for price cuts. And short term, this looked good. They were able to, make profits, things like that. But over time, the suppliers are like, okay, I can do this, but I'm going to have to cut corner here, cut some costs here. And then you end up having your supply chain just sort of watering down the quality of what you're doing. That ends up eventually just wreaking havoc on the brand, right? And so now you're not thinking about those profits anymore, because suddenly you're just getting crushed by other companies caring about quality, things like that. So it was, when they were doing all this cost cutting at the time, it was highly celebrated. Oh, look, what a great job they're doing. This is a great, leadership. They're increasing our shareholder value. And then the brand just sort of tanked over time just because of taking that view. So I think that's one that comes to mind for me. So when we look at what we're talking about here, so we're talking about Nike, you got this sort of cost savings related, looking for the lowest bid, right? So we've seen fashion industry just getting into a lot of trouble with sweatshops or child labor over the years. GM, I just mentioned, same thing, just that short-term focus, shareholder value. Mattel, outsourcing to China, cost savings related, and just not paying attention to the details of this. So I want to go over some good stories now and kind of pay attention here to the shift in consciousness, or the attempt to shift consciousness. Some of the companies that we're going to cover here, some are trying to get there, but this is really just the shift from modern consciousness to postmodern consciousness, if you're stepping back from everything, with elements even evolving a little bit past that. So, when we step back and look at evolution, this is an important story. Sometimes this takes a decade or two. Frankly, it takes too long, I think, like we mentioned, because they're chasing those quarterly returns and stuff. So let's talk about Patagonia. This is one of those sort of Bliss businesses where they're looking at every part of what they do and building love into it. Let's hit on Patagonia. What are they doing for their supply chain?
So this one's an example of actual really great application of being ethical in their supply chain. So, for example, they practice fair trade certification, one of the first major company to adopt fair trade certification for its products. They pay a premium for every fair trade certified item. So it's just a commitment that they make. They're also responsible in their sourcing. That's a company-wide initiative, making sure that the materials are coming from suppliers who also adhere to strict environmental and social standards. And they use recycled material, organic cotton, traceable down to ensure that the raw materials meet high ethical standards. So they've got a whole supply chain, not just on getting the product, but how the product gets certified all the way through the entire supply chain. And they also do they participate in an environmental assessment program. They've developed their own, in fact, and they evaluate the impact they have on their suppliers, or that their suppliers will have on them. So they're self-regulating in many of these things. They're not waiting for some law body to say, this is what you should do. They're just taking a high road doing it. Very transparent. Their ability to trace every piece of supply, where did it come from, who made it, who's working there. That's key. It's not like, just close your eyes and hope it's not some kid working in some sweatshop. That they don't do that. Everything is eyes wide open, full transparency. They've also implemented social responsibility programs to ensure fair labor practices. So they're not just taking care of their own, they're out there evangelizing these practices. And they're standing up for people in general to make sure that this isn't something that becomes standard. They fight for fair wages, safe working condition, no child or forced labor. These are some of the things that they're actively evangelizing against. And then they also do a lot of training for their suppliers too. So they recognize if you want to get a good partnership, it's not just counting on them to have it all together. If you're going to have a higher standard, then go train your suppliers on what those standards look like. I think it's a great investment that they're making, because ultimately it ensures that they are getting the best partners and best arrangement. So, they also have a partnership with NGOs and other certifications. just a significant investment, all the way up to even animal welfare. They'd have campaigns and advocacy for broader systemic changes in their industry. They're focused on waste reduction and recycling. So, net, they're the company who's not only taking the high road for themselves, they're actively influencing their industry for better. And it's not a surprise. They have a very strong following, very dedicated, loyal customer base, super high quality products, and people are willing to pay a little more for that because you're going to get a better source product, and it's a guiltless, expense, really. You don't have to worry about, I got this for cheap, but who made it and where did it come from? So I think this is an example of a company that's really taking ownership of being empathetic across the board, how they serve their clients, even helping their vendors and partners, training them. That's an extra step. Most companies won't do that. It's like, well, it's up, you get us the supply, how you do it, we don't care, right? It's like, no, we actually care about the whole process. We want to help you guys step up and be better. So kudos to Patagonia. They're doing really good in their industry. And that's a company that's actually really well, very profitable, doing good revenue. So they're not struggling. So proof point right there.
Yeah, what I like about that is it was just like layer after layer after layer. It wasn't just one thing, it was 10 things, right? It's all these different areas of focus. And that's, you don't have to tackle all of them at once, but you should keep tackling them, right? Until you feel like you've got this dialed in. Let's talk about Nestle. So they've faced some issues with child labor in the supply chain. A few years ago, there was a lawsuit brought against them, a lot of press on this. But Ash, let's run through like some of the details of what they're doing with their supply chain, which I think, it's a good example of how to try and address this if you can. And you, like I said, you just keep working on it. Obviously, being sued for child labor in the year 2021.
It's wild.
Should have happened a couple decades ago, taking care of something. But let's talk about what's being taken care of and how it's being done.
So Nestle responded with offering now an income accelerator program, which is interesting. I'm just going to read a few notes here. The objective of the program was to strengthen the value chain by improving the livelihoods of the cocoa farmers. A couple program details that they were trying to push forward: behavioral change. They want to incentivize for good agricultural practices, school enrollment, agroforestry activities, and income diversification. The details are also supposed to help fight against disease. So they have a disease mitigation program, effective reduction of disease and pests on farms, financial access being promoted, especially inclusion and access to loans that these individuals could have access to that they didn't have before. And then lastly is women's participation, training on gender equality and entrepreneurship for women. Now, what's interesting about all of this is that these were the achievements that were occurred after they rolled this program out. For the cocoa yields, a 32% increase due to high quality pruning. Income improvement, total net income of participating households rose by 38% with higher proportion achieving a living income. Child education increased child schooling rates by 10% with incentives. Income diversification, significant increase in small business investments, 21% to 55% from 2022 to 2023. And then lastly was a women empowerment initiative, 52% increase in women enrolled in village savings and loan associations. Now, what was interesting about this is that the key takeaways is the livelihoods of the individuals involved with the companies increased dramatically. And in fact, when that increase occurred, when they showed that they actually cared about the farmers, their production and quality of production increased. The issues that were arising that maybe some employees were cutting corners or maybe some manufacturers were cutting corners, now that they were being incentivized against those activities, the production of the quality of the product became a lot better. So this is just one example where they went from having a bad rap of labor issues to now offering programs to benefit the employees outside of just work themselves. They're able to actually now have livable wages, have a livable experience in life, where they're actually able to live their lives. They're able to invest back into themselves. And in doing so, they gave back into Nestle and the products that Nestle's offers. So I think that's a huge shift from let's see how we can get the most out of our manufacturers or our vendors versus, hey, how can we give them the best, or at least work with companies that offer these to their employees so we can get our best product from these vendors. I think I found that really, really interesting.
It's a holistic approach. It's not just, hey, we're going to address this one thing. I like the incentives related to sending your kids to school so you can push be more of a proactive of trying to, get them out of the child labor situations in those countries. I like the training. Again, another company kind of trying to train, local farmers or vendors, things like that. And then, that more of that, that holistic approach regarding, women and financial education, things like that. And this is a pilot program, and I think they're just starting to roll this out. But it's just stepping back for a second, just looking at this from the grand scheme of things. This is, like I said, consciousness sort of evolving, right? It's like, hey, we need to think about the whole supply chain here, and we need to think about it in an ethical way versus, what we've been doing for the past 1,000 years.
Yeah. And I think one of the wonderful thing about this is that these companies, these two examples, there's many others, not enough though. There's definitely others. They're not waiting for some government body to tell them this is the standard. They have a purpose that they live by. They stand for something, and they're not just standing for it on their own. They're being the body that's pushing this to everybody else, right? So sometimes there's this thought process, well, we need regulation to make this happen and that happen. But, for consumers, any company that's actively out there educating, working with their partners, standing for something, advocating for something, and it's not just some PR effort. You can dig in and see the kind of efforts they're putting forward. I think it says a lot about that business and that company, that they're not just caring for their consumers, they're actually caring for the whole planet. They're caring for better standards. And that's ultimately what empathy is about, is being of service to others, not just understanding the needs of others and fitting a need or creating a great experience, but it's actually going out of your way to serve others, these are two great examples of being of service.
Yeah, and I think absolutely, like Patagonia, they walk the walk, right? And they live by, they have their purpose. They have it all dialed in. Nestle, I feel, was more one of those, like, hey, sort of the consumers really pushing them to internally make some changes there. So I think you've got all these factors that can go into that. And so Nestle, to me, it's like, okay, this is like a pilot program. This is you addressing some of this. They've got to kind of prove it out still, right? They've got to keep walking the walk and just not let this be like a one-time thing. It's like we talked about, layered on. And so I think they're still kind of getting some pushback. This reminds me kind of, there's a story with Unilever and their sustainable palm oil kind of issues. So this is one where they were getting pushback from different people to fix kind of their farming practices and agriculture practices around palm oil, and they've took all these different aspects to trying to fix that. They did, A, B, C, D, and E, fixing it. But they're still getting some pushback on some of their issues related to, I think they had protesters come to like an annual meeting, right? But I like how they kind of responded to it. Was like the CEO at the time was like, yeah, absolutely, want to hear you out. Let's talk now. And they had leadership addressing it right then and there with them. And then going forward, just trying to be very proactive, like, this is not what we stand for, and we want to take care of this. So you could kind of feel a little different element there. Like, yeah, they actually do seem to be caring about this, not just giving us lip service. They wanted to deal with it right away and are kind of surprised by whatever the issue was. And they wanted to continue working forward to that. So that was kind of this one middle ground, I think, sort of company that's maybe shifted and is still in the process of, consciously evolving in what they do. But it felt like a genuine response to that annual meeting, to the protests there, that, I think you could work out a win-win with everybody involved in it, because the employees working there actually felt like they cared about this issue.
I think of it like this. It's like, you could wait till the doctor tells you you're about to have a heart attack, so you should go work out and go to the gym and take care of yourself. Or you can be proactive about it and avoid getting the heart attack. Either way, you're going to have to go. So whether you go as a response to an emergency, or you go proactively to avoid the emergency, or you can choose row 3, which is just do it because it keeps you healthy and fit, and you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. Now, granted, there's some people have, hereditary issues. Not even if you work out, that doesn't do anything. But it's just an example of like either be proactive or be reactive. But one way or the other, at some point, consumers are going to come knocking and saying, "Hey, you need to fix this."
More so now than ever before. So I think that's why you've got to be proactive now, right? It's being reactive all the time. You're just going to end up getting shelled, like GM or maybe Nike, taking a big hit. Some of these companies, if you're just reactive to it, you're going to pay the price like Mattel did, right? Hundreds of millions of dollars. So there's financial incentive there. But I think more so now, the public's going to hold you accountable, because consciousness is evolving. And 10 years from now, it's not going to go away. It's just going to be even stronger push. 10, 20, 30 years from now, consciousness is going to evolve and push even harder, and make sure you're doing some of these practices like we see, like a Patagonia doing. So let's talk about, for a few minutes here, what are some of the things we can do as businesses to embark on better relationships with our vendors? I think the first thing that comes to mind to me, and we talked about a little bit last episode, was just treating them as partners rather than vendors, right? In your communication. That might be like a case with Nike, like we talked about, right? It was just they're for low bid vendors versus we mentioned kind of Starbucks trying to make partners with their farmers, right? That previously, like, hey, here's training, here's how we want to do it. So there's a difference there of that vendor partner relationship. I think that's one thing. How about just aligning the purpose, like we talked about, making sure that you're choosing vendors that have a similar purpose or values. I think that's a huge one. That if you've got those higher purpose values and you're looking out there and you don't see vendors that are explicitly saying, hey, we take an empathetic approach to whatever your need is. If you don't see that, that's an opportunity for some company at some point. It's like, hey, let's be that company, because there's going to be people looking for that type of relationship. So I think that's another thing. And what comes to mind for you as far as Tulio or Ash, anything else there as far as, what lessons or takeaways we can?
I could piggyback quickly just off a couple of things that you said, Steve, but it's one thing to look for vendors that align with your values. I think there's also you laying out what your values are when deciding on certain partnerships and seeing what the reaction feedback would be on that. You just laying out, this is who we are, this is how we do things. Do you guys follow and align with this? And seeing what the vendors say.
Like being real clear. Hey, this is actually what we're about, right?
And I think that was the big pain point, that during that time, let's just take back mid-90s, right? You have to imagine the bonus check, the gentleman that discovered the vendor that then went ahead and who gave the bonus check within his company to the person who discovered this opportunity of employing, lower underdeveloped areas of the country and putting them in terrible conditions. The reality is to your point, they just, in terms of what the mission was at the time, the mission was cut costs, maximize profits. You have to imagine the people making and brokering the deals just did not ask the questions, right? And during that time, if that was the mission, if the question did come up, they told Sally or Stu to keep quiet. We don't want to talk about how the steak is cooked. Just get us the steak, I imagine now those questions are being asked today, before they make that partnership. Hey, what are your practices like? How, what programs do you have? Does it align with our values before we make a decision? We're not a profit first company. We have something bigger that we're working towards, a Northern Star. I think those conversations are happening now because there's an awareness. I think just at the time there wasn't, right? And I don't think what doesn't get discussed are the whistleblowers that probably got shut down, lost their jobs. Anyone that had any empathy at the time or was thinking at a higher conscious level, they were probably punished, right? So it was a very odd time, you have to imagine. So yeah, really having those conversations, but being aware at the time, those questions weren't being asked, and that was the difference between a profit first company and the implications that occurred from that. And today, where we're talking more about higher consciousness and giving the best that we can to our employees and our customers, and having those right relationships with our vendors.
We will do a whole show at some point on incentives going sideways.
Right.
And if you're solely focused on that incentive and not focused on that purpose and having those align, let's start with Wells Fargo.
Right.
We'll talk about that. We'll do a whole show on that. But so, Tulio, any last thoughts on this?
I like this idea of providing training. If you're going to stand for something, then go out there and train the people you work with.
Lead, right?
Lead, yep.
Yeah, just lead. Be a leader in your space. Now, and I was thinking about this. If you're a big brand, it's a lot easier, right? You've got a lot of buying power, so people just kind of listen because they feel like that's part of doing business with you. That happens, right? But if you're a small company or even a solopreneur, how can you apply this? Well, it just goes to making the effort to say, hey, when I work with vendors, I want to ensure that my brand is properly represented. But this is what I stand for, like I had mentioned earlier. This is what I stand for. This is what we stand for. And we want to put it out there and train other organizations on how to do this. I remember working with a company, we eventually got acquired, where it was a World Blue certified company. So it was a freedom-based type company, self-managed environment. And what eventually became radicalpurpose.org was just a bunch of us from that company deciding we're going to go and evangelize the way we do business. And we're going to help other companies learn about freedom in the workplace and, remove all this hierarchy stuff that's not necessary. Doesn't mean we won't have hierarchy. It just means more people will follow those willing to lead. It's not your traditional hierarchy. So it's not about flat. And what evolved from that was this whole initiative. We just recently had one of the co-founders of Radical Purpose on the show talking about the fiat lenses and all that. But the point is, it was an initiative to evangelize our model as a company to our clients. So we did a lot of training. I remember I did workshops with clients. I was part of the relationship to help them learn about these self-management principles. I'll never forget one of the founders and the CEO said, I have half the company fully in, and I got about the other half of the company that's kind of waiting to be told what to do. How do I get everybody to kind of act like leaders? I was like, well, we're experts at that. Let me show you what we do. We'll do a workshop to share how it's done. And it was transformative. And we did this with other clients. So this was just an example of standing for something, putting it out there, and then it became like a whole movement. 7 years later, this is a whole global movement now, right? But I think it speaks volumes when you believe in something as a business that you can go help your partners, your vendors, and even your clients adapt some of the principles that you believe in, especially if they're benefiting your business, and you offer it at no cost. And you're doing something good. So I believe that going out and training and evangelizing what you believe in and offering that for free, that's the whole point, is just put it out there. Yep. is a great way to nurture your partners and vendors as partners. It's a great way to do that. And even your clients too. You can even teach your clients some of these principles, which is mind-blowing when they start to adapt some of those things.
That's what I mean. That's kind of, that's us. Like we're actually the vendor, and like this podcast, this is trying to nurture the clients to.
We'll walk in the walk.
we're kind of going the other sort of direction in a ways with, as a vendor, trying to bring it that way. So when we talk about taking that more holistic view of your business and mention the vendors, partners, stakeholders, this is what we mean. This is just a huge part of helping raise consciousness in business. You may be there yourself as a company. You may have that great purpose you live by, but if we start looking for vendors to operate with this higher mindset and we value that, that can change not just your business, but other businesses as well. So, closely evaluate who you work with. That's it for today's show. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time on the Bliss Business Podcast.